It is that time, Monday morning. You are listening to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is indeed my show. I love that intro. I hope you guys are doing all right this morning. We are here. We are puttering about. I'd have to get me a new hat at some point. But nevertheless, we are doing the news once again, and I hope you guys are good. I'm glad that you guys can join me on this new episode of the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. We have a damn good show for you today. Damn good. And a long show for you today. In fact, let me check two things before we kick this off. I don't hear echo, so that's good. And the volume is at 64, which is perfectly fine. That means this boat is rocking. Damn good show for you today. Jeff Rich, he's going to be on the show, The Burning Archive. We're going to talk about what seems to be morphing into a Russo-European war, basically another one. We're also going to have Mark Sloboda. He's going to be on at 8:15. Obviously, I do the show with Ted Raw from 9 to 10, but at 10 o'clock, we're going to have Karen Kowatowski. And at 10:30, we will have Laith Maroof to talk about what's taking place in Lebanon. Obviously, Israel has gone on a murder spree. And let me fix my tie. In my thumbnail, my tie is like all over the place. But obviously, Israel has gone on a murder spree and expanded the genocide further into Lebanon. From my understanding, at this point, they're moved south of the Litani, or at the very least, you can say from their perspective, north. But the reality of it is they have gone on a murderous kill campaign in Lebanon. And it's apparently, some reporting is that they've asked the Trump administration about going further into Beirut in regards to bombing. Now, all of this is disgusting. Clearly, they've murdered like 3,000 people over the course of the last several weeks. Beyond the murder of the several people, a question needs to be asked. Why the uptick in violence in this way? Now, the reality of it is Israel has taken, 60% of Gaza, something to that effect. They're occupying that much territory. And they basically put out an edict that they're going to expand that to 70% of Gaza. The people who I talked to in the area point out that the conditions that people in Gaza are effectively living in, and that not much has changed short of, you could say, the extermination campaign that they were running, but from the standpoint of the conditions that the people are effectively living in. More to the point, why is Israel doing this now? And I suspect a lot of this has to do with, let's say, the heightened talk of negotiations with the Trump administration between Iran and the U.S., because Iran has effectively said that Israel is a front in a war in the Middle East, and that the U.S. needs to get its mad dog in order. Now, if indeed Israel asks the U.S. about bombing Beirut, this will add credence to that. And if the U.S. wants a deal, Israel must be included in that deal, which is going to create an interesting dynamic for people who often question whether it's the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail. Obviously, Iran seems to believe it's either the dog wagging the tail or some amalgam of both, but it's the belief that the United States ultimately controls its mad dog, and that mad dog in Gaza and Lebanon needs to be put down. And what it seems as if Israel is doing a mad scramble for the next stage of any negotiation that takes place, considering it seems that the U.S. cannot go on indefinitely in regards to this kind of energy crisis. Obviously, this is an economic war. Sure, we get trade-offs fired, but ultimately it's an economic war. Iran doesn't have the capacity to fire missiles to hit Washington, D.C., or California, or pretty much any of the homeland. It does have the capability of hitting missiles, or let's say hitting bases that are surrounding it in the Middle East. The U.S. apparently did bomb strikes on command and control facilities in Iran. Iran responded with fire on Kuwait. it's saying that Kuwait was the location that fired or that the attack was launched from, in which case Kuwait became open to attack. Iran is doing a tit for tat. Basically, we're going to put a tax on you every time you put a tax or you attack us. I'm saying TAX, not attack, even though I know it sounds like I'm saying that. I'm pointing out that they're doing tit for tat. We will escalate when you escalate, period. Now, a question or comment can be made that response needs to be far more significant. By the same token, it's Iran that is running the war. They know their capabilities. And I wonder whether this is ideological or whether this is material. I don't entirely know which one. Meaning, would Iran's attacks be more pronounced if they had the capability of having more pronounced attacks? Or meaning which means they're fighting within their limitations. They're fighting within limitations. Or is it ideological? Sure, our attack could be more robust, but we prefer to do a tit for tat for ideological reasons. I don't know which one. As an American, I assume that they're fighting within their limitations, meaning they have hard limits in regards to what they can do against, let's say, the U.S. not seemingly caring about getting hit in response. I don't know which. As an American, we tend to be maximalists, so I assume that they're doing what they can and fighting within their means. Either way, this is an economic war. And there is a question of how long this economic war, or how much of this economic war, Trump can tolerate. Now, truth be told, what seems to be happening is that Trump is manipulating markets. Now, I don't know why markets are still paying attention to anything Trump comes out with or Trump says. And yet they seem to, in which case fuel prices remain relatively stable in the US. Sure, they're at $4.50, and sure, diesel is near $6, but it's been stable at those prices for a while, despite the fact that the war continues and there are thousands of boats sitting in the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran popping off shots whenever one of those boats pops its head up. Or for that matter, obviously, it's not necessarily the most, let's say, enthusiastic thing for a ship captain to be fired upon. Hence, they stay where they are. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, it's unclear to me how long the U.S. can, or how long Trump can manipulate oil markets while simultaneously sabotaging what ultimately will be a U.S. surrender. I'm not a triumphalist. It's not that I believe that this is an automatic win. Iran obviously needs to play its hand to the degree it can play its hand against a superpower. But let's be honest, it's played its hand up to this point, considering its deficits and considering the U.S. excesses. Very well. What is Trump going to do? He seems hesitant for military strikes because I would imagine he knows the consequences of those military strikes, or at the very least has a sense of the threat to the U.S. economy in those strikes if oil effectively evaporates. He's in a fix. He's in a box. And he seems to be in a holding pattern, which obviously does not look good for a U.S. president. You will not get a better deal than the JCPOA, regardless of what Trump says. He's lying. We will see if any deal comes out of this at all. But I strongly suspect, and I still go with the idea that there will be renewed strikes, even if there's skirmishes. But I don't believe for a moment that the U.S. is just going to acquiesce to a deal with what it considers to be a weaker power. We'll see. I see my guest is in the background, though, and we have a lot to talk about. I am joined with the one, the only, the man from down under, Jeff Rich. How you doing, Jeff? You doing okay today?
Very well, Jamal. Winter has struck here in Melbourne. It's a very cold, stormy, windy night.
But, is it?
Yeah. but it's not always sunshine in Australia, is it?
Well, it's warm here. I mean, we're
Well, there you go.
Yeah, we're going to have summer months. Dr. Jeff Rich, he's a historian, author, retired government official from Melbourne, Australia, with a, let me get my glasses. This always gets hard to read. With a PhD in history and over 3 decades of experience in government. He created the Burning Archive YouTube channel and Substack, where he shares commentaries, book reviews, and interviews on world history, culture, and politics. Jeff has written 4 books, including 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat. Jeff, I'm glad to have this conversation with you. And I saw your email before you came on. And yes, let's have that conversation about what seems to be transforming into a larger Russo-European war, for lack of a better term for it. Give me your thoughts. Where do you think? See, I got to be honest with you. I thought for a long time that this war wasn't going to end and it was going to morph into something much more nasty, because it didn't seem like Europe could call it a day and back off. In fact, from my point of view, and I think I mentioned this to you before, I thought the Europeans were far more cynical than I think even you thought, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I thought the entire point was to throw away Ukrainian lives until Europe got to the point of being able to, quote, fight a war or handle the Russians on their own, which was U.S. strategy of effectively handing off responsibility to various theaters, because the United States, like the Romans, can't necessarily carry the entire world's burden on our own. I mean, after all, we're $39 trillion in debt, and we're well past that at this point. Give me your take on this. Do you think I'm being too cynical in my thoughts about what the Europeans are doing? And do you think this is morphing into a Russian-European war? What are your thoughts?
Well, the idea that it's morphing into a Russian-European war is the thought of Professor Richard Sakwa, who's one of the world's leading experts on Russia and Ukraine. He wrote the book Frontline Ukraine about the situation up to about 2018, 2020, something like that. And he's actually just published a book on the history of the Russia-Ukraine war as well. And he was doing a podcast interview with George Samueli and Peter Lavelle of the Gaggle. Peter Lavelle, I think he's still on RT, has various shows on RT as well. And it was in that context that he was saying he fears it's morphing into a Russo-European war, by which he means the USA is sort of pulling out, and Europe is hardening and mobilizing, I guess, a lot more around its sort of war project, so to speak, over Ukraine. And, some of the rhetoric from the European politicians, particularly around, Ursula von der Leyen and your favorite Kaja Kallas, has been pretty harsh. Comments like, we love Russia so much, there should be 40 of them, let's break it up, sort of thing. And, the EU has pursued a bit of a militarization strategy as well. So I do think there is quite a degree of truth to that there is increasingly within Europe a sort of locking in behind the sort of the aggression towards Russia, and similarly increasing exasperation, anger, annoyance, etc. from Russia that all these drone attacks, etc. start happening. I have a somewhat slightly different perspective as well, which, my analysis over a while, which I haven't revisited for a little while, has been that it's best to see this as a 5-state war, which is Ukraine, Russia, the USA, Britain, and the European Union. And with the USA, despite everything it says, is still heavily involved in this war. So, and the reality of Europe and NATO's military operations, command and control structures, infrastructure, interoperability of its weapons systems, the way its troops work, the intelligence services, all this kind of stuff with heavy US presence and interoperability between Europe and the USA means it's not so clear cut to really say, Europe's doing this or the USA is doing it, because it's a little bit murky about exactly what's happening. But I think one should be pretty, upfront and clear that Europe has since 2014, I think, pursued war objectives, let's be blunt about it, or at least policy objectives, strategic objectives, in relationship to Ukraine. And sometimes they've been in conflict with, or, in alignment with what the US wants to do and with what Britain wants to do. And sometimes they've been a little bit more discrepant. And I think really the situation we're finding now is that Europe is Europe is Ukraine's neighbor and Russia's neighbor, and the United States can maintain the fiction that it's not involved by retreating off to the Atlantic, even though it's providing all the intelligence and surveillance and et cetera, the military bases and the infrastructure. But Europe is locked into this sort of fight that they increasingly feel that they cannot lose, for prestige reasons, probably for financial reasons, just the legacy of rebuilding in Ukraine, as well as any sort of military reasons. So it seems like we're increasingly almost escalating between Russia and Europe, which I personally think is an absolute tragedy. I think Russia and Europe should sort of realize that their common enemy is the United States. But
it's not Russia. It's not Russia. Look, when Putin goes out and gives these speeches, and he is like, I don't know if you saw the interview that he gave, I think it was a couple of days ago.
No,
and he went on a tear about Europe. He was basically, these stupid idiots are selling out and selling out their populations to America. We should be working together. And if you think about it, when Russia was working with Germany with Nord Stream, it was the Americans that took issue with it. It was the Germans that decided to give that up. It's not the Russians. The Russians are perfectly fine with working with Europe. It's the other way around. And by the way, I would tell you something else about this. Well, not tell you.
Yeah.
But when, what is his name? Nebenzia, I believe, was at the UN, and he was giving his speech. And part of that speech was historical context that I have to be honest, scared the hell out of me. And scared the hell out of me because it made me think these guys are serious about this. Meaning Russia's very dodgy about its borders. Obviously, they're in a war in Ukraine right now. And when they're telling the UN, we fought Germany, and Germany is being empowered to rearm. And there's a historical context to the fight that we had with Germany, or for that matter, the fight that the Japanese had with China. This is, from my point of view, they're not saying this just to say it. These are warnings that are coming out that are getting more stripe. The allowing airspace to be used in Europe. Okay, that's a big deal. That makes them, that's a casus belli in and of itself. Allowing the locations in Latvia to be used to attack Russia. Again, these are problematic issues. Russia has done everything in their power to keep this isolated to Ukraine. And Europe seems to be using the fact that they're trying to keep it isolated to Ukraine as a mechanism by which to attack them. I mean, give me your take on that. It doesn't seem like it's the Russians that don't want cooperation with Europe. It seems that Europe doesn't want cooperation with Russia.
Well, that would seem to be the case. I mean, yes, absolutely. I do feel that Russia, perhaps in retrospect, it probably made sense at the time, but in retrospect probably put too much effort or faith or hope into doing a deal with the United States after Trump came to power, with the view to getting the United States out of the war. And there's a strong element within Russia, which John Helmand talks about, who are pretty pro oligarchical interests in America and in Russia. So there has been that I mean, it goes back to Yeltsin, his sort of love affair with the United States sort of thing. So there's that element there in Russia. So I agree with you that Europe has been an aggressor, and I think Richard Sakwa makes the same point, that Europe has morphed from being a peace project into a war project, and Russia has become the external enemy. Right. And Richard Sakwa puts it in even deeper sort of historical context of saying that, in a way, it's as grave a security threat to Russia now from Europe as any time in the last, I think he even said in the last 1,000 years of Russian statehood, because we sort of have a mobilized, armed, and ideologically passionate, frenzied almost Europe, with Britain, safely calling the shots from the back seats, safe there across the British Channel, and well, I'm not safe, but that they might imagine themselves to be safe. Yeah. They're far from the front line. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And yeah, it's a real threat, and it's a deep economic threat that doesn't have any real solution. Whatever happens with the battlefield outcomes in Ukraine, there's this social mess on the doorstep of Russia, which is going to create, a long period of security risks of various kinds, human security risks. People movements and, just crime, and as well as terrorism and ideological fanaticism and hate and bad memories, and as well as direct conflict. So it is a very dark situation, but I also feel it's a situation that the United States also needs to take responsibility for, egging along and urging Europe to, fight the Russians so that the Americans didn't have to do it themselves, and, fight to the last Ukrainian and all that sort of thing. And the inherent possibility or potential for cooperation between Europe and, across all sorts of fields, not just geopolitics, but in economics and culture and all sorts of things, of positive, peaceful relationships between Europe and Russia is just so obvious, and so has been a big part of the history of the last 200 years as well, or, more than 200 years, last 500 years, let's say, as well as all the invasions and all the rest of it. So I just think it's just so tragic that it's gone this way. But I mean, it really is quite sobering to hear, as well-informed and sober assessor of the issue as Richard Sakwa talk about it in these terms, and really being quite pessimistic about how things will go.
I think he's right. I think it's existential. I really do. I mean, like, when Putin went in to Ukraine, initially there was shock, because none of us at the station thought he was going to go in.
Yeah.
But then when you think about it in Russian terms, okay, well, they've been invaded multiple times. You get the United States backing this overthrow of the Ukrainian government. This is the same government that overthrew Iraq, has been invading countries left and right. From the Russian point of view, that invasion was imminent at some point. Meaning they're looking at this through a historical lens, and they're looking at the love of the passion, the burning passion that seems to be in Europe to get wrecked. I'm curious, why are they so, as you point out, why are they so hell-bent to fight the Russians in this way? Because as you point out, there's ties that could be made. Like, it makes Europe is right there beside Russia. It makes all the sense in the world to cooperate. And they've been cooperating for God knows how long in regards to getting energy and everything else. Why? this behavior?
It's a very good question. And look, I think one element of it is the sort of transatlantic networks. So, I mean, I think increasingly one needs to not think of Europe and the United States as, entirely independent, sovereign, distinct actors. That they are states that mobilize institutions and networks and resources that intermesh and overlap and have some distinct interests, but also operate in a highly coordinated fashion with different factional focus, like the MAGA crowd or the Democrat crowd, neocons, different flavors over time.
Right.
And certainly I think the United States' anti-Russia frenzy since, in many ways since 1991, but on steroids since whenever it was, the Russiagate business, 2016, 2017, has totally poisoned the atmosphere and encouraged the most zealous anti-Russian elements within Europe and empowered them as well. Because the United States has a say in who is the head of NATO and all those kind of things. So I think there's that element of the sort of shared ideological frenzy, let's say, of the transatlantic networks, and there just doesn't seem to be enough of a strong counterbalancing faction within those at the moment to really sort of turn the dial down on it. The sort of oligarchical interests, to use sort of John Helmer's sort of analysis, just there to get business deals done and interests served, but they're not really going to sort of redirect the strategic direction of these complex states, military institutions and diplomatic networks across multiple nations. So that's one element. And then the other element is just the what we call the Russophobia, sort of Russia hatred sort of thing. And I just think that is, I mean, I don't know what the right analysis of that is, but I think it is a profound social phenomenon of our time. Just this antipathy towards Russia, both in the large parts of the general public, but also certainly within the elites. And I think that antipathy drives a lot of these decisions, especially in some of the states with historical grievances against Russia, which would include, Estonia, where Kaja Kallas comes from, may include Germany, you never know, and the states of Eastern Europe, Poland, and others. So that I think there is that sort of sentimental, socio-emotional element that is actually driving it, and provides this very supportive public environment for people to, go as hard as they like against Russia. I mean, I've over the years just found it at times just deeply shocking what, generally nice, ordinary people here in Australia will sometimes say about Russia and Russians. It's sort of like, I've been writing a lot about anti-Semitism on my Substack, and I'm not comparing it directly to that, but, anti-Semitism in its worst forms in, 1930s, 1940s in Europe, but also in the United States, was driven by some, dark elements of the human soul, let's say. Yes. And those things were there in the public, but they also informed key decision makers. So I think there's certainly that element as well. And then I think the third thing is the conflicting interests, and this is where one shouldn't be naive about Europe not being in conflict with Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's the second largest country in Europe after Russia. It is a big, has significant resources, significant number of people, etc. And Europe was pursuing, from the early 2000s, pursuing sort of economic objectives in Ukraine as well. Like Emmanuel Todd's book, The Defeat of the West, refers to German hubris in seeking to effectively, I guess, turn Ukraine into, in simple terms, like an economic colony, an extension of its sort of Eastern European industrial zone. Integrate the labour, etc. So Europe has absolutely been pursuing interests in Ukraine, and having invested so much in it now over the last period of time, it wants to get an outcome too, just as the United States wanted to get an outcome through its peace negotiations over the last year. So I think those three things of the sort of transnational elite networks, the ideological fanaticism or the social antipathy towards Russia that affects decision makers as much as the person in the street, and the conflicting interests of Europe, which have increasingly meshed with US business interests as well, have driven this disastrous set of decisions.
Have they just forgot what it means to have millions of Europeans die in a war? Because that's the thing that I keep coming back to. It's like, okay, so what is the thought? That you guys are going to confront the Russians? Okay, your largest military is getting trashed. So what do you think you're going to do? And even if you did think you can confront the Russians, what do you think is going to happen? They have nukes. It makes no sense to me. Have they just forgotten what it means to die in a larger world war? Or they just don't believe gravity is real?
Don't know, or maybe they think it won't get to that, or maybe they think through, if it's all drone, it's like drones hitting infrastructure, and not too many people die. That's okay. It might still have the same effect on the in terms of the political objectives that they're pursuing. Like if you can send 1,000 drones and it sort of damages 500 industrial facilities in Russia or whatever the calculus is, but you don't actually kill many people and you don't put any of your own people directly at risk there, then you may think, well, I mean, what's the harm in that? We still get our objectives of an enormous prize of the economic control of Ukraine, and potentially economic control of, at least a fair share of the largest territorial country and one of the commodity superpowers in the world.
They're dreaming. They're dreaming. Yeah. Like this
well,
is like,
people do dream. I mean, it's extraordinary how powerful people can often be driven by these grand illusions, but they are. But they're also driven by the situation. They're sort of like, how can we get out of this now? Like, how can we get out of this without a win? We can't. What's Europe going to do if they just pull out now? It's humiliating for them, as well as
so the issues are
probably expensive. Yeah, so they're sort of locked in the situation in a negative way. Again, I'm not defending that.
Do you think that's the main issue? That for all intents and purposes, under Joe Biden, they supported this full stock, like lock, stock, and barrel. And now Trump comes in, and Trump is ambivalent. Like, yeah, he's still running, like the CIA is still running the war or whatever.
Yeah.
But for all intents and purposes, he's focused on other things. And Europe is still stuck with the bag. And now you have Hegseth coming out saying, yeah, we're no longer going to subsidize Europe, which means basically you are now taking over the cost of the Ukrainian war. That's effectively what he's trying to say. They just can't back up. I mean, they've locked themselves in to a particular point of view, and it would look ridiculous for them to be like, okay, we got this wrong. It's ego.
Well, I think there is an element of that, which, I mean, it's not, it's sort of like, you know, how do you get yourself out of a bad situation? You need, like, you know, in a bad political situation like that, you're going to have some leaders and enough, you know, enough of a constituency for people to say, no, we've got to change course here. We have to change course here. I mean, it was like when Europe in the 60s and 70s sort of took a step back from America's Cold War zealotry and tried to form good relations with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I mean, détente was initially the idea of Charles de Gaulle. So it was very much a European-driven idea, the Helsinki Accords, all that sort of thing. But it required people who have enough political vision, enough political skill, and also a strong elite network to back them up. You know, you need to have the backers in the media and in all the rest of it. But what do we have at the moment? We have poor quality leaders who just sort of repeat, you know, media talking point nonsense and have no real historical vision of the potential and the history of the deep interconnections between Russia and Europe over, you know, 1,000 years. And we have what was my second point? I've forgotten the point, but
you made the point of saying the connection between Russia and
Europe. They don't have the political skill to sort of get themselves out of that, so they're just sort of you know, and they don't have enough backing because the media has become so monochrome, because the academic networks have become so monochrome, and because so much power has been vested in the, you know, the security bureaucracy or the security institutions, the intelligence services, the military, all the think tanks, all the consulting firms who are all just, you know, living off the permanent war against both Russia and the sort of rivals to the West. So it's sort of this. If you're in that situation, there's so much pressure on you to just, well, what's the next thing? How can we get our next win out of this? You know, let's manufacture another drone crisis in Romania.
There is one of to this that we should, and it's, I would argue, racist, or let's say superiority. Yeah. This idea that somehow they're morally superior, that, you know, like even in the media, when the media talks about Russia, they talk about them in a particular way. When we talk about Iran, we talk about them in a particular way, even China in a particular way. Yeah. And that it's always diminutive. It's always kind of like, well, the Russians are doing so-and-so, and us with our values are obviously morally superior. That lunatic from, I think it was Palantir, recently came out and made a statement saying, well, the Russians don't care about their people. Are you serious?
Yeah, I know.
That's what they believe. That's what they say. And by the way, they said the same thing about the Chinese. And even when they talk about the Ukraine war, it's like the Russian hordes. Russia has not been sending wave attacks. Just for clarity, right? They've been trying to preserve their men. And this is even in the face of people saying, hey, you need to be more aggressive. But that's the way they talk about it. And I guess my point is, when you talk about it in those terms, and I just mean when the media talks about it in those terms, the politicians talks about it in those terms, how can you ever make a deal with somebody who's the Satan, who's the devil, who's like Hitler?
Yeah, that's right.
Like, it's that stuff too, right? I mean, that plays into the way they look at their actions versus, let's say, Russian response or Russian actions.
Yeah, no, totally.
Because you could disagree with me.
Oh, no, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, you know, it's hard to know whether to call that sort of racism, but it is a
just call it morally superior.
It's mobilized. Yeah, or morally superior is a good way of doing it, but it's also mobilizing and validating forms of antipathy or social hatred. It's it's saying it's okay to dehumanize, to dismiss the humanity of Russians, to minimize the pain and suffering that they feel when their school children are bombed. Let's not even report it, that sort of thing. It's interesting because I have been doing all this stuff on anti-Semitism, so it's a little bit on my mind at the moment. And there's more than one sort of form of social evil. Let's say there's racism and there's anti-Semitism, but the hatred that people express towards Russia and Russians at times over the last, particularly since the war began in whenever it began, 2023, 2022. It seems so long ago now. It is quite shocking, and it mobilizes all these deep cultural tropes, like the Russian horde and when the war began, there was all this sort of all the nonsense about the Genghis Khan and the Mongols and all this sort of stuff, which in itself is a very old racist trope from Europe as well, that actually doesn't comprehend the nature of the Mongol Empire at all. But that's another story.
It's like it's close enough. Let's write.
So I just find it's so disturbing, and it's just created this terrible, terrible tragedy where it's just so hard to see how some sort of genuine reconciliation could happen at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like the world is sleepwalking into war. I don't know if you've ever read that, where basically how Europe sleepwalked into the First World War, one step after the next.
This is Christopher Clark's book, Brilliant.
Yeah, it feels like that to me, where it's like, okay, we've seen this picture before.
Yeah.
And one step after the next. I mean, for God's sake, Russia's fighting in Ukraine, Iran is fighting the United States, and the U.S. is backing both.
Yeah.
Okay, that looks dicey.
Yeah.
And now the U.S. is like, we need to confront China.
Yeah.
Okay, it seems like it's one war with multiple fronts. That's what it comes across as.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. This seems very dicey to me, especially with the degradation of the political space in the United States. And all of this stuff is kind of happening simultaneously. It seems like it's going in a bad direction, and I don't see the corner.
Yeah.
I just don't. But I suppose we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm curious on where's Australia in this. The Hegseth was in Shangri-La, I believe? Not Shangri-La.
Oh, yeah, the Shangri-La dialogue. Yep.
Was it Shangri-La? Okay, so I was right. Shangri-La dialogue. And effectively reiterating, hey, Australia and South Korea and Japan, we need you to, ready for China. I'm curious on how is Australia? I'm always fascinated by that because China is Australia's major trading partner.
Yeah.
And so it's like, hey, you need to go to war with your major trading partner.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. What's the response in Australia to that?
Well, again, there's a big discrepancy between the elite political response, particularly within the defence and security establishment, and I guess the general public response. And the general on Russia, there's I'm ostracized in Australia for my pro.
What do you mean? You're ostracized? What? What do you mean?
People look askance at the various things I say, but
really,
and there's very little, there's not much at all sympathy at all for Russia within the sort of general Australian media, even though, I mean, there's a not insignificant Russian community here and all the rest of it, but it's pretty bad. But more broadly with the China thing, the government, the opposition, the main institutions of the state are all pretty much locked in behind the US security strategy. If sometimes with a kind of like, oh, we wish they wouldn't be so crude about it, but, I guess it's in our interest to sort of serve America as well as possible. And as a result, there's really no real distancing at all, or no particular independent thought on foreign policy. There's like, Warwick, Powell, and lots of critics, etc., who do offer different views. And there's one or two politicians who are starting to raise questions, or they tend to raise those questions in relationship to China, but not in relationship to Russia, or particularly even sort of Iran. So Australia has continued to be this super loyal member of the US alliance system, and it's largely, I would say, because it not so much an attitudinal thing within Australia, because within Australia it's a very multicultural society. We've just got some data coming in that India is now the largest source of migrants to Australia, a very large number of Chinese migrants as well. So it's and it's a very high migrant, society, not at all like Europe or perhaps even like the United States. So it's not so much the social base that's driving this; it's the elite interests who are very locked into the US alliance. And, it's sort of going nowhere. We've got this huge AUKUS deal, which is like over $300 billion. That's going to give us these dud subs in 30 years and not really do much apart from make us a more likely target in any sort of war and allow sort of US nuclear ships to sort of base in Australia. So it's just in many people are just in absolute despair about the nature of it, but it's very hard to change because the army, the military, the sort of elite networks within the politicians all benefit enormously from being part of the Five Eyes alliance, and we get all the best intelligence, and we play a special role in special operations, and in addition, there's very strong financial interests between the United States and Australia. We get a lot of our capital investment from the US. So one of the big worries during the 2008 financial crisis was that the money from America was going to dry out, and no one would be able to, get any loans for anything in Australia. And the other thing there is the sort of media control. So Rupert Murdoch of Fox or Sky News, he's the sort of original Australian oligarch, really. His father was a successful newspaper tycoon. He set up his own sort of media company in the 1960s. And in the mid-70s moved to America and then sort of took over the world. And his media imprint, dominates, I guess, the Australian intellectual landscape in many ways. So, it's sort of it's a pretty bleak situation in Australia.
I want to get your take on something before I let you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think you and I have had this conversation about international law. In fact, I've had this conversation for a while. And they think I'm way too cynical. I'm like, dude, it doesn't exist. It's like, let the UN die. Like, I could be real extreme on this. The only reason I'm extreme on this is because I feel like the UN has failed in its responsibilities. So now there's this complaint that, well, the UN is running a budget deficit. It's running out of money. Apparently, the U.S. hasn't paid its dues to the tune of billions of dollars. Apparently, China has been very dodgy about paying its dues. And so Gutierrez has put out the complaint that by July or August, that they could cease main operations, or let's say various operations in the context of the UN, because they're not getting the money. And from my point of view, what have you done to deserve it? Meaning we've watched a genocide. We've watched a war take place in Ukraine, and for that matter, in Iran. We've watched the U.S. be the aggressor in the war in Iran. We've watched Israel be the aggressor in regards to Gaza. And the UN has done squat.
Yeah.
And so it becomes like, okay, well, what is the point of the UN? Is it just factional, where there's a rules-based order? And the moment that you get a faction, then nothing can take place? And if that's true, then the UN is a pointless endeavor. Now, that's me being a hard ass. And I know I'm being a hard ass on this.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Speaking of the UN, though, you're going to love this. So this took place at the organization that apparently is running out of money because the U.S. hasn't necessarily put money into it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Marco Rubio saying just amazing things.
I think it's a real test of the UN. Right?
Come on, Mark.
As something that functions that can solve global problems. What is the purpose of the UN? The UN was supposed to be a place where you could peacefully resolve global conflict. Right now, you have a country who is unlawfully, criminally, and illegally taking possession of an international waterway and blowing up commercial vessels and putting mines in the water. I don't know if people appreciate like how outrageous this is, how unacceptable it is that any country would fire and try to sink commercial vessels or put mines in the water. Both of these things are illegal. And so we're going to take it to the UN. And we're going to.
Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing. I mean, I heard there was a country that was shooting fishing boats with one or two people in out of waters with no warning, and then going back for a double tap.
Yes.
Bloody outrageous. I think maybe the United States should bring that to the UN Security Council too. It's just.
I mean, he says it with a straight face, and he like works himself up. It's outrageous that people are shooting fishing boats. He is blockading Cuba as we speak.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, we attacked Iran, not the other way around.
Yeah. Look, I do think the world is a better place because of the UN, and if there's one key fact about it, is decolonization. So in 1945, there were 55 states in the UN, and a third of the world was subject to colonial rule. And today it's kind of less than 0.001% is of people subject to colonial rule. So that is one of the major achievements of the United Nations, and it should never be forgotten. It has not been able to do all that it's aspired to do, but I also don't think, frankly, the United States can fail to accept direct accountability for that. And there's a very specific thing I learned about just recently in writing my various pieces on anti-Semitism, which include sort of discussing the sort of, the development of the close relationship between Israel and the United States, which was after the Arab-Israeli War, and then in 1967, it very much strengthened the relationship between Israel and the United States. And we had the sort of 1973 sort of oil crisis. And then in 1975, the UN General Assembly passed this resolution condemning Zionism as a form of racism, and talking about Israel as an apartheid state, that sort of thing, while South Africa was still an apartheid state in 1975. And let's not forget, the United States was one of the last countries in the world to, withdraw its support from that apartheid state in South Africa. But at that point, that totally flipped out both Israel and the elites in the United States about the UN. And this book I've been looking at by Mark Nazara on anti-Semitism refers to the then US ambassador to the UN, I can't remember his name, basically saying, we're going to have to go into opposition against, at the UN. And so basically from the mid-1970s, so that's whatever that is, 50 years ago. So for the last 50 years, the United States, in many ways, because of the intimate sort of social, cultural, political relationships with Israel, has pursued a policy of undermining the United Nations related to some of the same issues that we're complaining about now, Palestine and all the rest of it. And if it had not done that, the world would have been a very, very different place. So I agree the UN is in a very, very broken state. But I think there's one country on earth that has blood all over its hands and has caused that problem, and it is the USA. And I even think sometimes the UN should just expel the United States and say, you turn yourself into a decent country and then you can join the UN again. But and this is part of my brief, my disagreement with some of our your fellow guests about China's response to things, because I just think there's not been enough assertiveness from China and other major powers, including Russia, frankly, both of whom are members of the UN Security Council and so have a additional global responsibility for how the UN actually functions. There hasn't really been enough effort from them to force a change. And I just think we're probably now at the point like the League of Nations was in the 1930s, where it's going to break down and something else is going to get formed in its place. But that could take 5 to 10 years.
I guess the question that I would have is it I'm sorry, you've gotten into an interesting area from my point of view, because I agree with you. I agree with everything that you're saying, but I think it's because we're in the West. Like, meaning we are products of our cultures.
Yeah.
And the US can be very aggressive militaristically and diplomatically when it's going after an objective in a way that China seems to be less so. It's super interesting. Like when you're talking to Chinese guests and they're like, it's under control. Everything's great. We just need to coast. We'll be all right. We'll have a better world. And from our point of view, it's kind of like, dude, are you serious? Like, meaning if you have the capability of being more boisterous and being more assertive against a naked hegemon, you should do so. And I feel that way about the Russians, but they're already in a war.
Yeah, they are.
It's China that feels
like and so I do feel there's and I disagree with the people who say it's all fine, and because they tend to say, well, what do you want China to do? Fight World War III? And it's sort of, hey, there's a couple of other steps you could take.
Right. Never need to go to war. Right. It's like, you guys can be a little bit more boisterous. Yeah, we're not trying to fight a war. Nobody's asking you to fight a war. No, I agree with you on this front.
Yeah.
Is it possible to even have a body like the UN and a hegemon? Meaning, is the next iteration of it no hegemons? Is it that? And I don't even know what that world looks like. I don't even know how you get a world like that.
Yeah, well, in practical terms, people claim the title of hegemon.
True.
The United States claims the title of hegemon, but in reality, does it have that? Is it the world's? Is it clearly the dominant military power, or the dominant economic power, or the dominant political power, or cultural power? Any of those things? It isn't really.
Really? People respond to it like it is.
Well, they do. But I guess that can go in the blink of an eye as well, and that's where I wonder whether China hasn't got a little bit of rose-tinted glasses about the good United States that helped China sort of, climb back out of the mess of the Cultural Revolution with Deng Xiaoping and all that sort of stuff. I do think there's a element of strategic blindness there. I don't think it's just a different cultural disposition. I actually think it's a misjudgment, an overvaluation of their capacity to sort of ride the waves of history, an underestimation of the violent degradation of the violence of the United States and the degradation of its sort of political system and culture and all the rest of it. And I just think it's just a little bit. I don't know if complacent's quite the right word, but yeah,
they seem to be very chill.
Yeah,
and it's wild. And I'll let you go after this. I guess comment back and forth. John Helmer, I think, makes a really good point where he points out it's like, and I think what Helmer is getting at is when I asked him the question, he went kind of a roundabout in order to get to the point. But if you listen to him, he makes a point.
Yeah.
Where he's like, dude, the Russians we're already at war. The Iranians are already at war. And it's like these three countries, China, Russia, and Iran, are almost like the fulcrum and the guarantor of a new world in the context of a more fair, just, I don't know, a world based on world order, or at the very least law, as opposed to the kind of unruly naked aggression that the U.S. is effectively showing. And China has been very chill about the fact that these two countries are at war currently, where it has been able to kind of coast without it. Now, it's fascinating hearing him make that point. I agree with you.
I do agree with that. And the other point I'd add to it is the other crucial country is India. And, China has not been entirely so chill with India over the last 5 to 10 years as well. And I reckon if India and China could have a different dynamic, that would make a very dramatic difference in terms of the world diplomacy. Even just on the UN Security Council, there's lots of people in India who believe that China's been blocking India being on the UN Security Council for decades. So I think it really is important that all the members of the UN Security Council get their feet put to the fire in terms of the extent to which they're actually helping the international system work productively, rather than just whinging about what's going on in America.
Yeah. Jeff, I always appreciate these conversations. And I often, anytime when I'm talking about you or your channel, I often talk about how good the channel is and the interviews that you have on that channel, the Burning Archive. Yeah. It is informative. It is a great channel. I saw the things that you were doing on China recently also. Great channel, man. And just for the audience would know, Dr. Jeff Rich, he's a historian, author, retired government official from Melbourne, Australia. With a PhD in history and over 3 decades of experience in government, he created the Burning Archive YouTube channel and Substack, where he shares commentaries, book reviews, and interviews on world history, culture, and politics. He has written 4 books, including 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat. I would love to, by the way, have book reviews with you if you ever want to do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
I don't know if you are purely a nonfiction reader. Yeah. I used to do only nonfiction, and somewhere along the way, I think it was the 3 Body that got me into fiction, where it grabbed me and just had me in the fiction literature. But for the longest time, I only did nonfiction. If you want to do book reviews, I'm down. You can pick a book. Yeah. Go with it. I'll pick a book. We can go with it. We can share it on the channel.
Well, we could do like one of these shows, like on one of. Do you mean we could just talk about a book? Yeah, sounds great. Yeah.
I'm down for that. I'm totally down for that. I'm a sucker for that.
It'd be a lot of fun.
Wait, it doesn't have to just be books. It could be movies. It could be any of those. Yeah. I was having a conversation with Nick on Killmonger and Black Panther, like whether Killmonger was right and what he was going after. And I get enamored by that stuff. I get enamored by moral quandaries. that people get put into where they may have a right answer, but they do it in the wrong way. And it's like, okay, he's a bad guy, but he has a point.
And fiction in either, like literary form or film, is just such a great way of sort of putting yourself within that moral quandary, isn't it? So let's do that sometime. That'd be great, Jamal.
I am totally down for it. Jeff, Dr. Rich, you have a good night, man. Be safe, okay?
You too. Ciao, everyone.
All right. Shout out to Dr. Jeff Rich. I love talking to Jeff. He is fantastic. Coming up very shortly is going to be Mark Sloboda. What time is it? In fact, Mark is going to be up in about 10 minutes. As we pointed out, the U.S. is talking about, Israel is talking about bombing Beirut. Now, this bothers me greatly for obvious reasons. I don't like to see people lose their lives, but I also actually have friends that live in Beirut. So this, to me, is disastrous news. One of the things that I do want to point out again, well, I guess there are two things. One, the economic damage that we're taking here in the United States, for whatever reason, oil, and I know the reason, they believe Trump won't let it get to about a certain extent, but they're acting as if Trump is in control of the situation, where Donald Trump, I don't believe, is. Fact of the matter is, Trump is sabotaging any kind of negotiation that's going to take place. Apparently, there are dueling deals back and forth, but for all intents and purposes, we're at a stalemate. As Donald Trump gets his mind right to surrender. This is Trump when asked about whether he cares about the pain that Americans are effectively going through right now. And of course, this is an answer.
To what extent are Americans' financial situations motivating you to make a deal?
Not even a little bit. The only thing that matters when I'm talking about Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. That's all.
That is going to be run during the election over and over and over again. I don't care about Americans' financial situation, especially when you find out, or at the very least, they run immediately after that comment that Iran wasn't looking for a nuclear bomb. That's even under Donald Trump's own director of national intelligence that will be on her way out very, very soon. Apparently, she's claiming that her husband has cancer. I believe she's probably right that her husband has cancer, but that's probably not the reason why Tulsi Gabbard is effectively leaving the administration. And I would go so far as to say she should have left in more of a huff. And it's interesting that she didn't leave in more of a huff in the way that Joe Kent left, where he effectively left with an indictment of the administration on his way out. I would argue that as a national duty, not necessarily sleeking away in the shadows. The other one I want to show once again, because just how wild the comment is Marco Rubio claiming that the United Nations should get involved in opening the Strait of Hormuz, something that wasn't an issue before the U.S. attacked Iran. Not to mention the blowing up boats and everything else from the standpoint of Venezuela. All of these things, it's just outrageous. And yet Rubio would get up there and say, well, the United Nations should do something, even though we're not even funding the United Nations at this point. There's something that Jeff said, or the commentary and the conversation we had with Jeff about UN, whether the UN has value. And I think it does, just not in the form that it's currently structured. It doesn't work, but that's okay. The reality of it is, to get slightly philosophical for the moment, and not even philosophical, I guess I look at it as mechanical. If you look at your societies, the individual society of states, the larger society of nations, and the world as a whole, all of these things are almost like organisms. They grow. And they grow in a way that seemingly tries to balance out to reach a certain degree of stability. When something doesn't work, as in the United Nations, and part of the reason it doesn't work because there's a hegemon. How on earth can the United Nations get anything accomplished when there's always a singular entity or a group of entities that lumped in with that singular entity to tell the UN to basically to fuck off? It doesn't work. And so whatever comes behind it, ideally, hopefully, it would at the very least have some structures in place that would allow it to function. But again, how does that work in the context of a hegemon? Whether that's the US, whether that's something else. And what you may get is a balance of forces. But again, a balance of forces can be unwieldy. And I suspect, and I would argue, that that's what you have now. Russia, China, Iran, India, versus what you could call a Western conglomerate of the US, Europe, Australia, adding Japan to that mix, and maybe adding South Korea, but South Korea's government has been a bit adversarial at this point to US interests. I mean, hell, he's talking about he's going to arrest Netanyahu if Netanyahu steps foot in Seoul. But you get a world that is effectively broken with the United Nations completely incapable of minding the gap. In which case, you get a United Nations that is a pointless endeavor. Will that change? That is a damn good question. I would argue it has to. For it to be a viable entity, it has to. This is Rubio, because I did say I was going to play this one more time, because this video is outrageous.
It's a real test for the UN, right? As a function, as something that functions that can solve global problems. What is the purpose of the UN? The UN was supposed to be a place where you could peacefully resolve global conflict. Right now, you have a country who is unlawfully, criminally, and illegally taking possession of an international waterway and blowing up commercial vessels and putting mines in the water. I don't know if people appreciate like how.
That is amazing. I swear to God, that's like a superpower. Isn't it? To be able to just lie brazenly, just brazenly lie. Look into the camera, look into a person's eyes, and just brazenly, just radical hypocrisy. I see my man in the background, though. Let me bring him in. I don't want to delay. We are joined, the man, the legend, Mark Sloboda, international relations security analyst. And of course, you can find Mark at boosty.com if you look in Realpolitik with Mark Sloboda, or if you just put in his name. Mark, how you doing today, man? You doing okay this afternoon?
I'm alive, Jamaro. How the hell are you?
I'm alive too, believe it or not. According to it was shock some. But Mark, I'm glad to have you. And I have like 10 issues on my page. And I got to be honest, I'm not even sure where to start. I guess let's start at the attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now, Ukraine tried to make it look like it was the Russians that were attacking their own power plant, which is very bizarre considering it's in Russians' possession. But this is rather serious. The IAEA didn't necessarily seem to make a big thing about this, but obviously there's a hole in the side of a power plant made by an FPV drone. What is going on with this? And you know what? Better story. Kiev. I want to get on Kiev for a moment before we go on to Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Russia has pointed out that Kiev is now fair game, and even went so far as to tell all the diplomats and everyone else, whoever is in Kiev, to leave. Zelensky has been out begging for air defense, saying he sent a worded letter to Trump. Trump didn't respond, and that the U.S. is apparently not producing enough air defense for the Middle East and for the wars in Ukraine. Obviously, he's talking about himself. He seems freaked out about the whole thing.
As we've been saying for months, if not years.
Yes, we have. We've been saying that for a while now, right? Zelensky apparently is only now realizing this. Is this a new tenor to the war now? I mean, is that what we're looking at? I mean, they've effectively said Kiev is fair game, and we're going after decision-making centers. Is this an escalation?
Okay, so yes, we can expect ever increasing escalations, ever increasing provocations, ever increasing atrocities and red lines moving forward. I mean, that is what the conflict is going to be. We've got now enough signals. The Kremlin, those who believed that there, for whatever reason, that there might be some type of political settlement, some deal achievable with Trump, have effectively given up that ghost, right? As the Russian presidential foreign policy aide Yuri Ushakov, which is essentially Putin's national security advisor, was asked about the spirit of Anchorage by a journalist last week. This phrase that has been tossed around by certain people within the Russian side over the last year or so. Supposedly some type of understanding that was reached with Trump that the U.S. never acted on, that Trump never followed through on. Like he never really follows through on anything else. So that should not have really been a surprise to them. But Ushakov replied that there really is a spirit of Beijing. It is a real thing. And as far as a spirit of Anchorage, he's not sure whether such a thing ever existed. And he said that he certainly never used that term, which sounds like actually a little bit of a slap against Putin there on that one, to my mind. But the Europeans, not only is there no settlement, it's impossible even to talk to them. I mean, years later, they're still talking and arguing amongst themselves about talking with Russia. Who would talk to Russia and what they would say, and they have no clue yet, except more war, right? That's so. And absolutely, there's nothing possible with the Kiev regime. The latest, outrages, the attack, the Starobilsk massacre against the college dormitory in Lugansk, and now, I mean, we have seen repeated attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant for years now. I mean, years. We've been talking about this for years, and they start out, in the outside town of Energodar, and then they're moving in, and then there's storage facilities, and then they're hitting the electrical lines that bring emergency. That bring power to the pumps and so forth. And it's important to understand, one, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Okay. Two, it's been shut down, in cold shutdown now for more than 2 years, right? Going on 3 years. So it's not running. It hasn't been. That said, you still do need to maintain a certain degree of flow of cooling water to the reactor, right? To prevent a catastrophic situation. Now, there are fail safes. There's regular pumps, and then there's emergency power and diesel pumps and the reservoir pool and so forth. And as far as I can tell, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has never really been in a type of critical jeopardy yet. And such a thing would be hard, right? You can't attack the reactor itself. The dome surrounding it would require at the least a TAC nuke hitting them. But some of the equipment, like the cooling water pumps, right, are vulnerable, right? Are more vulnerable, the power supplies and so forth. So this was the first strike that actually was targeting one of the main machine buildings of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And evidently, it didn't actually damage any machinery, but it did blow a hole in the wall. So this is a serious escalation. And already, since then, we've seen a further attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, right? And there was a point reached somewhere over a year ago, where it was quietly admitted, I somewhere in the mainstream media, I believe it was the New York Times, but don't quote me. It was a source of record that, it has been the Ukrainians attacking the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, because Russia controls it all along. But that's vanished once again into the 15-minute memory, and we're back to pretending that, well, we can't tell what had happened. It was probably the Russians, right? Because they can't accept the acknowledgement that the regime they're supporting in Kiev is insane enough to attack a nuclear power plant on territory they claim is their own to control, right? With their own supposed citizens to rule over there. They can't admit that. So they accept any provocation by the Kiev regime, no matter how outrageous, no matter what they do. If they lined 10 people up on camera and shot them in the back of the head, the Western mainstream media would figure out a reason to blame Russia for it, right? So, I mean, that's you can't deal with these people. The only thing is the battlefield. That is all there is. It's various forms, because there's more than just the physical battlefield, but the war, the conflict, the special military operation. The Kiev regime must be removed. This is a mad dog, right? It keeps, obviously this is a provocation, right? They're not achieving anything by attacking the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, right? They're not regaining control of the territory. They're not cutting power because it's not, providing power to any, it's not an energy infrastructure. This is just a provocation out of spite and provocation. And they're trying to provoke Russia continually into over response, something that would drag the NATO countries into the conflict. That's ultimately always the ultimate goal. And if Russia responded by, say, hitting one of the 3 remaining nuclear power plants under the Kiev regime's control in Ukraine, then that might be justification, right, for the voices of Europe. Oh, we have to act because the mad Putin is attacking nuclear power plants. Never mind what preceded it, right? That's the kind of, and indeed there were responses from Dmitry Medvedev exactly to that point, that if the attacks on Russia, on Zaporozhye nuclear power plant continue, then attacks on power plants in the Kiev regime controlled parts of Ukraine, the 3 of them left, or power plants in Europe are fair game. Now, here's the problem: is I don't believe the Russian government is going to do that. So that is kind of a toothless threat, a toothless bluster. There are multiple reasons why it would be stupid for Russia to respond to that provocation by giving the NATO countries. There's plenty of other level of responses possible. But that's, the type of escalation. More attacks on civilians, right? More attacks that assassinations, murders, that sort of thing. That is what the war will be. It will not get any better. It's just going to get nastier and nastier as the possibility of, not just victory, but even, a holding on the front line becomes more and more impossible. The resort to more unconventional warfare, asymmetric warfare, whatever you want to call it, right? David Ignatius in the Washington Post a year ago called it the dirty war. And he said the dirty war has just begun. Yeah, the dirty war is still, it's going to get much worse, right? That's to understand. This regime is not going to go quietly. They're not going to sign papers. They're not going to surrender. They're going to try to burn the world, Ukraine and the world, if possible, down with them.
Well, is it fair to say that, I think you pointed something out, and I think it's an interesting dynamic that seems to be taking place. Ukraine and NATO nations seems to be creating provocations to get Russia, let's say, to strike NATO nations, or at the very least,
Yes.
tempt them to do so. And the reason why I have to bring it up,
This
because
event in Romania.
yes,
This
the
most
event in
recent
Romania
drone
is
strike.
one, allowing the drone spaces to go through
Yes.
Western countries,
The Baltics,
allowing
yes.
the platforms in Western countries. All of these things are cost us bellies. Like, all of them are provocations.
Yes, they are. And there was
But
just
Russia-
today another tanker carrying Russian oil, not a Russian flagged ship. It was flagged.
Taken by France.
Yeah, it was the Tago, I think. It was stopped by the French in international waters, and it was amazing to me that Macron dared to claim that it was in line with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But certainly is not. It's blatantly illegal piracy, right? It is piracy. It is if it was flagged under Russia, it would also be an act of war. Now, whatever country it's flagged out of is not going to go to war with France out of this, right? It's a part of the maritime commerce and shipping industry, that is simply making money by transiting Russian oil from point A to point B. But that is a further provocation. Now, we've heard a lot about, over the last 2 years about interception of Russian ships, or more frequently, the shadow fleet, again, meaning the maritime shipping industry that continues to trade with Russia. It happens in spurts, right, of activity, and then nothing happens. I mean, and when there's dozens of tankers every day going back and forth, it's selective provocations. They don't have the capability, right, to stop every tank, right? They can't blockade Russia. They can't blockade the Gulf of Aden. First of all, if they tried to do that, that would be an act of war, and Russia would respond it. But even if they tried, hunting down every tanker in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or whatsoever, that would be impossible for them to do. They don't have that type of naval capability any more than the U.S. has the naval capability to effectively enforce a blockade of Iran supports cities in the Gulf of Oman. But let me point out the insanity of this. We are in a global energy crisis, right? In large part exacerbated by the U.S. Israeli war on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and everything else that has resulted from that. And their warnings about the amount of oil and oil products, that we're at a precipice, that we're looking forward, if this continues for another month, to global depression. The Europeans are going to be completely out of jet fuel, and there will be a diesel and gasoline crisis in Europe and everything like this. And yet they're seizing oil, right? Not because they're going to steal it, because they won't do that, not the French. The Trump might. But they're going to detain it and thus push global prices up more. You idiots. Every time you attack an oil refinery in Russia or something like this that does negligible damage to the behemoth size of the Russian energy industry, but the stock market, right, the price of oil is an emotional creature, right? It is human agency. It is not logical. It responds to every up, down, every BS social media post by Trump, right? They react in all kinds of crazy ways. And you keep interflowing with the shipping of tankers around the world or blowing up refineries. That is going to help push the prices up more and more. And while ultimately, right, that sort of thing doesn't affect the economy of Russia, as time and time and time again have shown out, because you reduce some of Russia's oil exports a bit and you push the global prices up, and Russia still makes bank selling less for more. That is the impossible logic of pursuing this war against the world's greatest global commodity supplier. It just the strategic logic is it's broken. It does not work. It has not worked. We're 5 years into this now, and they're still trying this same dumb thing. And all they're doing is further provoking and further leading to calls within Russia and by Russian sympathetic voices. Oh, you need to do something. We need to drop some nukes. We need to kill some leaders. We need to attack their oil. This. Meanwhile, the Kremlin, cold-blooded to a fault, realist pragmatists they are, they're still in this box of the war of attrition and the proxy war, and they everything is about the math, right? They understand that they are in a war, not just against the Kiev regime, not just against NATO, but the entirety of the collective West, right? I mean, Taiwanese drone production that first goes to Europe and then to the Kiev regime is hyping and ramping up. South Korea, Japan, everything, right? So it's not even just NATO. It's the entirety of the collective West. But as far as the Russians are concerned, they're doing the math, and Russians love their math. Let me tell you, the math still adds up to them winning, right? You hit an oil refinery there. You hit a girls' dormitory in Lugansk there. These are, a terrible personal tragedy. But ultimately, they're looking at the strategic math. And it's still, as far as they're concerned, despite everything that's happening, despite all the provocations, comes out in their favor as long as they stay in this box, in the war by these rules. It is only if they are provoked outside of that box that the math becomes uncertain, that we don't know where a direct Russia-NATO confrontation ends, because nuclear is always a possibility. And the West, particularly the Europeans, but the Americans as well, as a result of the unipolar moment, have forgotten their fear of nuclear war, of mutually assured destruction. The Russians, the Chinese, right, they have not. They have not, because they are the adults in the room. And there's so many calls that Putin needs to respond to this. They can't let the Europeans get away with this. And that's that if you fail to deter them, they will keep escalating. And that's true to a degree. But ultimately, they always come back to that terrible math. And they say, despite this, for now, we are still in that box, and we don't want to go outside of it because we are confident that we can still win this war, not just against the Kiev regime, not just against NATO, but the entirety of the collective West, if we stay in this box.
No, I understand the logic.
It's real easy to say that Russia should, provoke outside of that. But ultimately, Putin has to make decisions not as a knee-jerk Call of Duty outraged Call of Duty warrior, however good their intentions, right, on social media, right? However, their geopolitics is right, their conception of what's going on is right, but their emotional outrage, right, at really, dense, right? We had this comment from the Wall Street Journal last week that the Kiev regime is hitting Russia's oil industry, but failing to dent Russia's economy. That's right. These are pinpricks, right, for the size of Russia. Yes, there's still an outrage, but the Kremlin does a very good job of not responding to outrages, except, of course, for Dmitry Medvedev, who is their dedicated anger management translator, right? I mean, he's the one who vents for them, for the Russian people, for that audience. But ultimately, the fate of roughly 150 million Russian people and a few million Russians in Ukraine and other surrounding countries more. And more than that, you could argue the fate of all of us at a terrible, spiral down event outside of that box is a possibility. And the Russian government is at its core, it is conservative and cautious in foreign policy. And, it's easily understandable why.
Right.
And they are pushed and they're pushed and they're pushed. And suddenly they respond and take Crimea, right? That's the way they work. The U.S. does this salami. The U.S., the Europeans, the Kiev regime, they do this salami slicing of escalations and provocations constantly and constantly and constantly. And Russia is not really responding. Certainly, it's not responding outside that box, right? The Europeans, do some new provocation. They allow their air corridors to be used, and Russia says, "Damn you, Baltics, you yapping chihuahuas!" And they raise their fist and they punch Kiev. Right? Or not even Zelensky, right? They don't, because despite Russia's saying they're going to go after decision-making centers, unlike the U.S. and the West, they still don't meet political leaders. They've made it clear they're not going to attack the Kiev presidential residence or the presidential offices at Bankova. They're not going to attack this Puch Rada, the parliament in Ukraine, because as far as they're concerned, one, Zelensky is never in Bankova, and two, the Rada, they don't consider them decision makers when it comes to military things. Now, you can quibble about that if you want, but ultimately, when they say decision making, they still mean military and intelligence services decision makers, not political. And to that, I say, well, that's not really a change of the rules of engagement at all. Technically, Russia has always been willing to do that. It becomes more a question of, shall we say, managing the public demand, understandable for response, right? With branding,
21 kids
to be done as a response, which I believe this dedicated now campaign, but it also has to do with capability, because now Russia is in a window they haven't been to this degree certainly before. The Kiev regime has no air defense left, right? No effective air defense whatsoever. Their Soviet legacy air defense, which was far superior, was worn down over 3 years, right? Now the hodgepodge Western provided air defense has been worn down or exhausted, and it's effectively non-existent. Right. On top of that, Russia's production of long-range strike drones, the capabilities of those long-range strike drones, and the production of missiles, of ballistic missiles, of cruise missiles, of hypersonic missiles, of friggin' Oreshniks now, has increased to such a point where they feel they can now begin a serious bombing campaign against the military intelligence leadership in Kiev. They now have the capabilities, increasingly with the Oreshnik, to hit the bunkers, right, deep underneath Kiev that they all operate out of, which is, part of what was limiting Russia before. And so now they're prepared for this. And already people are like, well, Putin promised to do this, but he hasn't done it yet. All right. So because it's not just diplomats that they have invited to leave. It's also Western NGOs and all of these other, bottom feeders that the Western ecosystem that exists in Kiev. They'll give them a good week to 2 weeks to get out of Dodge before they start following through on this. But I believe that ultimately, whatever they may claim this is a response to Starobilsk, this was going to happen anyway. It's time to coincide with the spring rolling into summer offensive plans, and they're capable of doing it now. And it's all, the Russian military really operates on timing of coinciding various things that are happening across the entire battlefield, that certain things should happen according to their own internal sense of sequencing and timing. That is probably for most of us, including analysts, it's really opaque. It's really hard to understand. But if you listen to them talk, right, to the Russian generals, that part of their strategy, their thinking of warfare, that timing is very part of what they do. They have plans, and they try to stick to those plans as much as is possible. And they're very long-term plans, particularly when Russia is engaged in what ultimately it does very well. If, it's not great for the age of social media and 24/7, it's attrition war. It's a slow, grinding, brutal, but the other upside of that is the war of attrition goes on. But for 99% of Russians, life continues as normal. The economy is doing from well to good, right? For some people, possibly even great. Life continues as normal. And so the single greatest hope against hope of the West has always been to create some type of political response, some political crisis in Russia, because they know they can't win on the battlefield in Ukraine. So, the original plan was the sanctions that were supposed to destroy the Russian economy and bring the people out into the street, and Putin would fall and Russia would collapse and be splintered. I mean, that was the plan. And everything since then, likely this attack on Lugansk, are designed to, as really political terrorism, right? By its truest name. They are designed to create a fear and political response in Russian society to compel the Russian people, to punish them, hoping, this is the logic of sanctions always, and across the world and all that sort of thing, that will make the government change policy.
Right.
It really rarely works, and it's certainly not a strategy that is working at all in this case. Russians are, after 5 years, there is a certain amount of remove. Life goes on, and the war happens for 99% of Russians, 99% of the time over there, right? It's not something that's happening here, but that hasn't decreased the support of it. In fact, if anything, I think the majority of the Russian people would be in favor of escalation, right? Particularly if that ended the war quickly. Although, again, the Russian government in that is extremely politically cautious about casualties. And whatever the nonsense coming out of the Kiev regime and its Western mainstream media stenographers, Russian casualties are still, despite being many more Russian troops involved along a much larger front now, Russian casualties are still on a long downward, slow downward, long downward trend. Well, of course, the Kiev regime's casualties are on the opposite end. And, despite all their nonsense statements, Zelensky keeps saying the Russians are now taking more casualties than they can take every month. It could not be further from the truth. I mean, it's like literally the polar opposite. They can say anything like Trump and expect it to believe. But if my bellwether on that is not only my understanding of what is happening in Russia, but this lovely Western information warfare outlet, Media Zona, right, funded by the West, with pro-Western, Russians and so forth. that keep track of actual verifiable Russian KIA by names, right? Something that is a real count, right? Not some made up number and so forth. And they're very good at finding the names and finding Action Russian casualties. I mean, they stake out cemeteries and they harass families and they bribe their way into databases and so forth. And some assessment has been made and even determines that an audit of their that they may be inflating numbers and there may be doubles, but even they can't find more than some. I think most recently it's like 230,000 Russian KIA after 5 years of war, which is a tragedy, but it's still a fraction of what the Kiev regime, and again, to keep inside, the state, the scales of this war, right? What is all, the stakes of it is going as well. Those casualties, as cold-blooded as it may be, are still well within Russia's calculus of the math, that don't provoke a negative response from the Russian population as a whole. Again, like I said, because they are on a slow downward trend, despite vastly more Russian troops being involved than were involved in the beginning of the conflict. And you don't have to trust my word on that, but you want to trust BBC funded Media Zona, who very quietly continues their count, but is never quoted in the Western media, because that's not a number that matches the ridiculous narrative and propaganda they are trying to peddle.
They're acting like it's a million, and it's just outrageous. I'm curious on something else. So you pointed out the battlefield, that effectively Russia is fighting within the context of a box because the ultimate objective is to win the battle in Ukraine, not this larger war with NATO.
Yeah,
basically, they're not trying to end the war.
They don't want. They still hope to avoid, whether that's possible or not, we can discuss, but they hope to avoid a direct war with NATO that would ultimately involve the United States and, do the math, how many, the probability that would then end in a nuclear exchange. And they want to avoid that. And it's understandable why.
Orekhov and Konstantinovka.
Orekhov and Konstantinovka.
Thank you, Konstantinovka.
There we go.
What is going on in those two locations? From my understanding, that I guess Makaris was using the term breakthrough. I'm uncomfortable using the term breakthrough, but at the very least, it seems like there's a military push in those directions.
Yeah. I mean, a breakthrough is an okay word to use here in Konstantinovka, certainly. Now, Russia has Konstantinovka is in the Donbass, and it's the tail end, the southernmost of the 3 Kiev regime cities that are their last defensive line in Donbass, something that we've long talked about, and now we're there, right? Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka. And Russia has been fighting inside Konstantinovka, right, starting in the outskirts and flanking it for half a year now, right? Slowly, right? The necessity, how warfare has changed with drones necessitate slow infiltration tactics, grinding attrition over time. But they are in a point now where they have the city surrounded logistically, like in terms of operational control on 3 sides now. And they have pushed through the center of Konstantinovka and taken the citadel, which is that is what is the citadel is a reference to the high-rise section of any settlement, the residential buildings that are turned into giant fortress barracks by the Kiev regime. Most of the civilian population, although not all of it, has long since moved, away, fled. And they use these buildings as fortresses. And they're always the hardest thing that takes the longest period of time to take. Russia drops fabs on them when it has to, but you can't fab an entire city, right, into dust, because the Russians aren't the Israelis, and they don't actually want to destroy these cities as much as possible, because these will be their cities, right? They are Russian ethnic cities, and they will be Russian controlled cities going into the future. So they would like to preserve as much of them as is feasibly possible. But the citadel in Konstantinovka has been taken, and now the logistics to the remaining forces in Konstantinovka are just absolutely impossible at this point because of Russians' own drones, right? And other means of operational control like artillery. There was a CNN report last week that came there. I actually put it in my weekend review. And, they became very much aware of how impossible logistics and movement was, that you can't move around in vehicles in or anywhere near Kiev regime-controlled parts of Konstantinovka because Russian drones are everywhere. And they had to make a journey that should have taken them, embedded with Kiev regime troops, some 50 minutes, right? Taking a look on the distance on the ground. And it took them more than 5 hours because they were, had to go into hiding some 14 times when Russian drones were, doing the terror movement in the skies, looking for targets and so forth. Russia, there are various estimates of exactly how much of Konstantinovka Russia controls at this point, and that really goes from 40 to 60%. So it's tough to say. But regardless, the Kiev regime's commanders on the ground are all crying that it's up, that we can't get any supplies, that we can't get out. And Syrskyi just flew into, well, not Konstantinovka itself, but outside of Konstantinovka. And, that's the death sentence. When the high-ranking leaders, that means the situation is bad and they're trying to, force their troops to stay and fight, to buck up morale. I don't think Syrskyi's appearance has ever given any Kiev regime troops any amount of morale. I mean, there's a region they refer to him as the butcher, and it's not because of what he does to the opponent, right? But the tactics he uses with regards to casualties to his own troops. But again, the Kiev regime commanders are seriously worried that everything is falling apart there. Now, falling apart, of a siege, if you will, that has started 6 months ago could mean that there's another month or two, on the other end of it. I think it was just in the past couple of weeks that the Western mainstream media finally quietly admitted that Russia took Pokrovsk over half a year ago, right? So, they will continue to fight and then fight in the outskirts and send infiltration groups back in and so on and so forth. But everything kind of rolls into each other now, right? Because this is one big urban fortress agglomeration going from Konstantinovka to a smaller Druzhkovka and then on to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And Russia's advancing from all, well, not every side, but almost every side, right? At the same time, they're also moving into the suburbs of Slavyansk. They're moving into the suburbs of Kramatorsk. Liman is, again, roughly 80% taken by Russia at this point, and Liman opens up the road through Izium to the north, the vulnerable north of Slavyansk as well. So it's all, again, coming together on this last defensive line. And I mean, this I believe that by the end of this year, I know Putin said that by the autumn that Russia could take Donbass. That's optimistic. But I think that by the end of this year, this last defensive line will be broken or all but broken. And then Russia will be, catching their breath for a moment and turning to the Kiev regime in the West and saying, are we done yet? And of course, they'll say no. And then Russia will go on towards Zaporozhye city and Orekhov in the south. Orekhov is not quite in the same position that Kramatorsk is in yet. There may be Russian troops fighting in the outskirts of Orekhov, but that's in the south, in the western Zaporozhye region. Orekhov is the small city that the ill-fated Kiev regime NATO offensive that Russia crushed in 2023 was launched out of. And Russia is very seriously bombing northern Orekhov now, which means that that's where they believe that the fight is going, right? But that Orekhov is still some time away from following. But again, it's about advancement, right? And the advancement on the ground is not always apparent because, of course, it's also an attrition war, which is something that is much harder for people to factor in, particularly because everything is propaganda about what casualties. Well, it's really only propaganda about the Russian side casualties because no one ever talks. The Western media never talks about casualties on the Kiev regime side. They never, ever, will address that topic. And, with good reason, why they don't. But there is advancement in Orekhov, even if it's still not at, shall we say, what the Kiev regime's commanders are calling the breaking point, like Konstantinovka is in the Donbass, and like Liman is in the southern Kharkov, northern Donbass area there. But that's at the same time, there were some 10 settlements taken last week by Russia all along the contact line. Some in Sumy, some in Kharkov, some in Zaporozhye, another one in Donbass. So there is, despite this noise about deadlock and stalemate, advance is slow, but advance is happening. And once again, the speed of advance is not the metric that Russia is using for this war. It's about the math. It's about the attrition. And it's not something people can feel satisfied with, and at some level, it is a matter of understanding and belief, I guess. But it requires a holistic understanding with a lot of attention to the details of this conflict. And a lot of it listening to what the other side is saying, not the nonsense coming out of Benkova, out of Kiev, but what the Kiev regime commanders are talking about amongst the ecosystem of themselves on social media and stuff like that. And then you get a sense of where they are, if you don't want to use breakthrough, they're at a crumbling of defenses, right? I mean, I don't use the big C collapse word. I never have. I don't believe in it, certainly not in military terms. But there's a crumbling going on. Yes, in Konstantinovka, it's comfortable saying it. It's been a long time coming, right? Russia, this has been going on since December. But, I mean, again, once the Donbass is gone, once this tight urban agglomeration is gone, right, that is great for defense, great for use of drones, all of these things. Once that defensive line is gone, then we're in open step. And that's not so good for the defender, right? That's not so good for the defender. So they tried to fight this war in the Donbass because it's the best geographical and topographical and demographical area to fight the war, to conduct their defense. And we're on that last defensive line, and the end of that defensive line is now crumbling. So that's where it is. Muted.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was muted. There's a train that comes behind me, and I shut the thing off because I don't like the horn to blow. Mark Sloboda, International Relations Security Analyst. I always say, Mark, you are one of my favorite people to talk to. Your analysis of this stuff is bar none. I thank you for it. You be safe, okay? You have a good day.
You as well. Cheers.
Bye-bye. All right. Shout out to Mark Sloboda. There we are. Shout out to Mark Sloboda. I am ending this. I'm going over to the program with Ted Rawl and I want to hit this before I go right here. So we have flying boar. It's easy for Mark to say because his kids aren't dying. Yeah, but Mark lives there. He's in the line of fire. Flying boar, look how Iran did in the Middle East. Well, even Iran is fighting within a box. Look at what they're doing in response. They're fighting within a box. Look at what Israel is doing. Learn from that. Well, Israel is going on a murder spree. I don't think anybody wants to learn from that. Sparky, Epstein, and Kushner. And yes, Epstein and Kushner. That is an odd thing to end on, but damn it, we'll end on it. Follow me on the program with Ted Rawl. It's starting now. Have a good one all. Be safe, be kind to the degree that you can be kind. I'll see you in a moment.